The rain comes first. Not the blood, not the screams that never came, but the rain. A cold June rain, drumming on the roof of a Rock Island train as it cuts through the darkness of rural Iowa, 1912 Tarty. Inside that train, passengers doze against windows streaked with water, their faces reflected ghostly in the glass. The wheels click a steady rhythm beneath them. Someone boards at the Villisca station, wet and hurried, just after midnight. A man whose name no one thought to ask. A man who disappears into history like smoke. But let us move forward now, through those final dark hours, to morning. To Monday, June 10th, 1912. To a white two-story house on East 2nd Street, where the Stillinger girls should have woken by now. Where the Moore family should be stirring, preparing for another ordinary day in this quiet town of 2,000 souls. Mary Peckham crosses her yard that morning, dish towel still in hand. She has noticed the stillness of the Moore house. The doors remain closed, the shades drawn tight against the late morning sun. The chickens unfed, wandering confused in their pen. She knocks. No answer comes. She knocks again, harder now, and something in that silence raises the small hairs on her arms. She tries the door. It swings open. What Mary Peckham found in that house would shatter the innocence of an entire town. What she found would echo across a century, refusing to fade, refusing to be forgotten. 8 bodies. 8 souls who went to sleep on a warm June night and never woke. Josiah Moore, his wife Sarah, their 4 children, and the Stillinger girls, Lena and Ina, friends invited to stay the night after church. All of them struck down with an axe while they slept. The weapon left leaning against the wall downstairs, its handle wiped clean, as if the killer had all the time in the world. But it is not merely the deaths that haunt us. Not simply the number or the innocence of the victims. It is the details. The terrible, inexplicable details that transform this from tragedy into something that defies understanding. The mirrors in the house, all covered with cloth, every reflective surface concealed. The bowl of bloody water left in the kitchen, as if the killer had paused to wash. The slab of bacon placed carefully beside the axe, uneaten, unexplained. The doors locked from the inside when Mary Peckham arrived, as if the murderer had sealed the house like a tomb before vanishing. And the children. 6 children who should have cried out, should have run, should have fought. But the evidence suggests they never woke at all. That death came for them in their dreams. The question forms itself in the silence of that house, in the space between heartbeats. Who could do this? What kind of human being walks through a sleeping household, moving from room to room, from child to child, swinging an axe in the darkness? What thoughts accompany such actions? What does a person become in those moments? The town of Villisca thought they knew evil. They had read about crimes in distant cities, heard sermons about sin and wickedness. But this was different. This evil had walked their streets, sat perhaps in their church pews, looked them in the eye. This evil wore a human face, though no one could say which face it was. The suspects would come quickly. Too quickly. Too many. The Reverend George Kelly found wandering and speaking strangely, later confessing and recanting. Frank Jones, a local businessman with rumored motives of jealousy and revenge. William Mansfield, a drifter with a history of violence. And that mysterious man on the train, seen by witnesses but never identified, slipping away into the rainy night while 8 people lay dead behind him. Trials were held. Accusations flew like bullets. The town tore itself apart trying to find answers, trying to put a name to the nightmare. But no one was ever convicted. No one was ever truly held accountable. The case remains, even now, officially unsolved, and perhaps that is why we cannot let it go. Why this century-old tragedy still whispers to us from the past. Because somewhere in our collective consciousness, we need to believe that such acts have explanations, that monsters can be identified, named, and locked away, that there are answers to every question, solutions to every mystery. The Villisca Axe Murders offer us no such comfort. Instead, they offer us something else, something darker and more unsettling. They remind us that sometimes evil simply is, that sometimes the worst acts are committed not by obvious monsters, but by people who might look like anyone. That sometimes the locks on our doors and the warmth of our homes cannot keep the darkness out. The house still stands on East 2nd Street. It has become something between a memorial and a curiosity. People come from across the country to walk through its rooms, to stand where those families slept their last sleep. And many of those visitors report something else, something that transforms this historical tragedy into ongoing phenomena. Shadows that move without source, voices of children heard in empty rooms, the sound of footsteps on the stairs at midnight, objects that shift positions when no one is looking, the ghost of a man seen holding an axe, watching from the corners, then vanishing like morning fog. Are these the restless dead, unable to find peace? Are they the echoes of trauma so profound that it has somehow imprinted itself upon the very walls? Or are they simply the products of expectation, the mind creating what it has been primed to see? Perhaps the answer matters less than the question itself. Perhaps what draws us to this story, what keeps us returning to it across the decades, is not the hope of solving it, but the need to confront it, to look directly at the darkness and ask ourselves what it means, what it reveals about the world we live in, and the fragile nature of safety itself. On that rainy night in June of 1912, someone walked through the streets of Villisca with murder in their heart. Someone climbed the stairs of that white house. Someone lifted an axe and brought it down, again and again, until 8 lives were extinguished. And then they vanished. Into the rain, onto a train, into history's unanswered questions. This is the story of what happened in that house. But it is also the story of what still happens there, of the mystery that refuses to die, of the voices that still call out from the past, asking us to remember, asking us to bear witness, asking us, perhaps, to finally give them peace. In the heart of Montgomery County, Iowa, where cornfields stretch toward horizons that seem to promise nothing but safety and predictability, the town of Villisca stood as a portrait of early 20th century American innocence. 2,500 souls called this place home in the summer of 1912, and nearly all of them could trace the interconnected webs of family, friendship, and obligation that bound the community together like threads in a carefully woven tapestry. This was a place where neighbors left their doors unlocked, where children played freely in tree-lined streets until darkness fell, and where the rhythms of life followed the reassuring patterns of planting and harvest, Sunday services and Wednesday prayer meetings, births and marriages and deaths that everyone attended because everyone knew everyone. And everyone belonged. The white clapboard houses sat in neat rows along streets named after trees and founding families, their front porches adorned with rocking chairs and hanging ferns, their yards bordered by white picket fences that marked property lines, but never truly separated one family from another. Women gathered in parlors for quilting circles and missionary society meetings, exchanging recipes and remedies along with carefully measured gossip that kept the social fabric intact. Men congregated at the hardware store and the grain elevator, discussing crop prices and politics, baseball scores, and the latest mechanical innovations that promised to make farming easier. The town had everything a community needed to sustain itself: a general store and a post office, a bank and a hotel, 2 newspapers that chronicled every wedding and illness, every business transaction and social gathering in exhaustive detail. At the center of this ordered world stood the Presbyterian Church, its white steeple visible from every corner of town, a constant reminder of the moral foundation upon which Villisca had built its identity. The church was not merely a place of worship, but the beating heart of community life, hosting socials and suppers, concerts and lectures, providing the framework within which families measured their standing and their worth. To be a church-going family in Villisca was to be respectable, to be trusted, to belong to something larger than yourself. The Moore family embodied everything that Villisca valued most highly. Josiah Moore, known to everyone as Joe, had built a successful business selling farm equipment and supplies, becoming prosperous enough to afford one of the finer homes in town, a 2-story structure painted white with green shutters, located at the corner of 2nd and Broad Streets. At 43 years old, Joe Moore was a man in his prime, respected for his business acumen and his involvement in community affairs. He served on church committees, participated in local improvement projects, and treated his customers fairly, extending credit when times were hard and celebrating with families when harvests came in strong. Sarah Moore, his wife of 18 years, was 39 years old and regarded as one of the more refined women in Villisca. She had been a teacher before marriage, and that education showed in her careful speech, her well-appointed home, and the attention she paid to her children's upbringing. Sarah belonged to the Missionary Society and the Literary Club, hosted teas, and participated in church activities with the dedication expected of a woman in her position. Her neighbors considered her somewhat reserved, perhaps a touch proud, but no one questioned her devotion to her family or her commitment to raising her children properly. Those 4 children represented the future the Moores were building together. Herman, the eldest at 11 years old, had his father's solid build and serious demeanor. He helped with chores and looked after his younger siblings with an earnestness that made adults smile and predict great things for his future. Catherine, just 10, possessed her mother's refinement and love of reading. Boyd, at 7, was all energy and mischief, the child most likely to be found climbing trees or chasing the family dog through the yard. And little Paul, only 5 years old, still occupied that cherished space of youngest child, indulged by his siblings and doted upon by his parents. On the 9th of June, 1912, Children's Day services at the Presbyterian Church drew nearly every family in Villisca. This annual celebration featured the Sunday school children in a special program they had rehearsed for weeks, reciting scripture and singing hymns, demonstrating to the congregation all they had learned throughout the year. Sarah Moore had helped with the preparations, ensuring that her own children knew their parts perfectly. The sanctuary filled with proud parents and grandparents, aunts and uncles, the entire community gathering to witness this affirmation of faith and family, of continuity and hope. The Moore children performed beautifully, and afterward, Sarah agreed to let Catherine and Boyd bring home 2 neighborhood girls for a sleepover, a treat to celebrate the successful program. Lena Stillinger, age 12, and her younger sister Ina, just 8 years old, lived nearby and were familiar playmates. Their parents, Joseph and Sarah Stillinger, agreed readily to the arrangement. It was a common occurrence in Villisca for children to sleep at friends' houses, another thread in the web of trust and familiarity that made the town feel safe. The group walked home together after the church service ended around 9:30 that evening, joined by other families heading in the same direction, calling out goodnights to neighbors, commenting on the program and the unseasonably warm weather. Joe Moore unlocked the front door of the house at the corner of 2nd and Broad, and his family, enlarged for the night by the 2 Stillinger girls, filed inside. The door closed behind them. Lamps were lit in the windows. The ordinary rituals of bedtime in a respectable household began. The house itself would later be described in excruciating detail by investigators, journalists, and the morbidly curious who descended on Villisca in the days and weeks that followed. But on that Sunday night, it was simply home to the Moores, a comfortable 2-story dwelling that reflected their status and values. The first floor contained a parlor and sitting room, a dining room where the family took their meals together, and a kitchen where Sarah prepared food on a modern stove. A small bedroom off the parlor served as a guest room, though it was rarely needed. Upstairs, accessed by a narrow staircase that rose from the front hall, were the family bedrooms where the children slept. The layout of those upstairs rooms would become crucial to understanding what happened in the hours before dawn. At the top of the stairs, immediately to the right, was the room where Lena and Ina Stillinger were given beds for the night. Across the narrow hallway was the room shared by Catherine and Boyd. Herman and Paul slept in a 3rd bedroom at the front of the house, overlooking 2nd Street. And in the largest bedroom, the master bedroom at the southwest corner of the house, Joe and Sarah Moore retired for the night. The house settled into darkness and quiet. The children, tired from the excitement of the day, likely fell asleep quickly. Joe and Sarah extinguished their lamp. Outside, Villisca slept as well, secure in its routines and certainties, in the belief that such a place was protected by its very ordinariness, by the strength of its community bonds and shared value. But beneath that wholesome facade, darkness gathered. Small towns in early 20th century, America harbored secrets that everyone knew but no one acknowledged openly. They maintained careful hierarchies of class and respectability, drawing lines between those who belonged and those who existed on the margins. They fostered grievances that could simmer for years, hidden behind polite greetings and Sunday smile. They created pressure to conform, to meet expectations, to maintain appearances, regardless of what roiled beneath the surface. Sometime in those dark hours between midnight and dawn, someone entered the Moore house. Whether through an unlocked door, common in Villisca, or by some other means, an intruder moved through the first floor and found what he needed. In the guest bedroom, leaning in the corner, stood Joe Moore's axe, a tool that every household kept for splitting kindling and other ordinary tasks. The killer took the axe in his hands, feeling its weight, testing its balance. And then he climbed the stairs. In the absolute darkness of a house where every lamp had been extinguished and every curtain drawn, he moved with methodical precision, as if he knew exactly where he was going, as if he had mapped out his route beforehand. He knew which bedroom held the parents, the greatest threat to his purpose. He knew where the children slept, innocent and trusting in their beds. What happened next would shatter Villisca's sense of itself, would expose the fragility of the barriers between civilization and savagery, would demonstrate that no amount of church attendance or community involvement could protect against the darkness that some human beings carry within them. The brutality that visited the Moore house that night was so extreme, so incomprehensible, that it challenged every assumption the town had made about safety and trust, about knowing your neighbors and belonging to something good. The morning light would reveal horrors that transformed Villisca from a symbol of American innocence into a synonym for inexplicable evil, a place name that would echo through the decades as people tried and failed to understand how such darkness could descend upon such ordinary goodness, how a killer could move through a sleeping household with such terrible purpose, ending 8 lives before disappearing into the dawn, leaving behind only questions that The morning of June 10, 1912 began like any other in the small town of Villisca, Iowa. The sun rose over modest frame houses lined up along quiet streets. Neighbors expected to see familiar faces emerging for their daily routine. But at the Moore residence on East 2nd Street, something was terribly wrong. Mary Peckham had known the Moore family for years. She lived just across the street, close enough to notice the rhythms of their household, the comings and goings that marked the passage of ordinary days. Josiah Moore was a successful businessman, well regarded in the community. His wife Sarah kept a tidy home. Their 4 children were polite, well-mannered. The family attended church regularly at the Presbyterian congregation where Josiah sometimes served as an elder. They were, by all accounts, unremarkable in the best possible way, the kind of family that formed the backbone of small-town life. That Monday morning, Mary noticed the Moore house remained unusually still. No one had emerged to tend to the animals. The chickens in the yard had not been fed. The family cow lowed plaintively, clearly in need of milking. These were not tasks Josiah Moore would neglect. He was methodical, responsible, a man who took his obligations seriously. As the morning wore on, the absence of activity began to gnaw at Mary's mind. She crossed the street, her concern growing with each step. The house stood silent in the growing warmth of the June day. She knocked on the door. No answer came. She knocked again, harder this time, calling out for Sarah or Josiah. Still nothing. The silence had a weight to it, a quality that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. She tried the door and found it locked from the inside. Moving around to the side of the house, Mary peered through a window. What she saw made her breath catch in her throat. The interior was dim, curtains drawn against the morning light. But she could make out shapes in the guest bedroom, forms lying still on the bed. Too still. Even from outside she could see something was covering them, fabric draped over where faces should be. The sight was wrong in a way she could not immediately articulate, wrong in a way that made her stomach turn. She hurried to another window, then another, trying to understand what she was seeing. In every room where she could glimpse inside, the same strangeness prevailed. Mirrors were covered with cloth. Curtains blocked out the light. And everywhere, that terrible stillness. No movement, no sound. Just the oppressive quiet of a house that should have been alive with the noise of children and daily chores. Mary Peckham ran to fetch help. She found Ross Moore, Josiah's brother, and together they returned to the house. Ross tried calling out, rattling the doors, but like Mary, he was met with silence. Finally, he located a key and unlocked the door. The moment they stepped inside, they knew something horrific had occurred. The air inside was thick and close, heavy with a smell that Ross would later struggle to describe. The house was dark, every window covered, every source of natural light blocked. As their eyes adjusted to the dimness, they began to move through the rooms. In the downstairs, guest bedroom, they found two small forms on the bed. The Stillinger sisters, Lena and Inez, who had been invited to stay the night after attending church services and a Children's Day program with the Moore family. White bedclothes covered their faces. Even before Ross pulled back the covering, some part of him knew they were dead. He and Mary moved upstairs, each step an agony of dread. In the master bedroom, they found Josiah and Sarah Moore in their bed. Their faces too were covered with bed linens. Moving to the children's room, they discovered Catherine, Boyd, Paul, and Herman Moore, all lying in their beds, all with their faces carefully covered. 8 people, an entire family, and their 2 young guests, all dead. Ross staggered outside and telephoned the town marshal, Hank Horton. Word spread through Villisca with terrifying speed. By the time Marshal Horton arrived, a crowd had begun to gather. The marshal entered the house and conducted a quick survey of the carnage. What he found would shake the small community to its core and launch one of the most baffling murder investigations in American history. Each victim had been killed by blows to the head. The murder weapon was quickly identified as Josiah Moore's own axe, taken from the chopping block in the yard. The killer had used the blunt end of the axe head to bludgeon each victim as they slept. The violence had been extreme. Skulls were crushed. Brain matter and blood spattered the walls and ceilings. In some cases, victims' faces were rendered unrecognizable by the ferocity of the assault. Yet, for all the savagery, there was also a disturbing precision to the crime. The killer had moved methodically through the house. Evidence suggested that Josiah Moore had been attacked first, struck down before he could rise to defend his family. Sarah Moore appeared to have been killed as she lay beside her husband. Then the killer had moved to the children's room, murdering each child in turn. Finally, the Stillinger girls downstairs had been killed. The sequence suggested planning, a careful progression from the adults, who might fight back, to the vulnerable children, who likely never woke. But it was the strange ritual elements that elevated this crime from brutal murder to something far more unsettling. Every victim's face had been covered with bedclothes. White fabric draped over crushed skulls, hiding the damage, concealing the staring eyes of the dead. Throughout the house, every mirror had been covered with cloth or clothing. The killer had moved through the rooms after the murders, systematically covering any reflective surface. In the guest bedroom, where the Stillinger sisters lay, investigators found a bowl filled with bloody water. Someone had washed. The killer had taken time after the murders to clean themselves, to tend to the blood that must have covered their hands and clothes. Near the bowl, they found a piece of bacon with a bite taken out of it. In the kitchen, more signs of the killer's lingering presence emerged. Food had been taken from the icebox and partially eaten. Cigarette butts littered an ashtray and various surfaces throughout the house. The implications were chilling. After bludgeoning 8 people to death, the killer had not fled. Instead, they had remained in the house for hours. They had eaten food from the Moore family kitchen. They had smoked cigarettes, perhaps sitting in the darkness with the bodies of their victims nearby. They had washed in a bowl of water that turned red with the blood of innocents. And they had performed their strange ritual, covering faces in mirrors, with a deliberation that suggested deep psychological compulsion. Investigators attempted to reconstruct a timeline. The Moore family had attended a special Children's Day program at church the evening before. The children had performed. Lena and Inez Stillinger, daughters of a family friend, had been invited to spend the night. Witnesses reported seeing the family return home around 9:30 or 10 o'clock that evening. Josiah Moore had been observed securing the house for the night. At some point after that, the killer had either gained entry or was already hiding inside, waiting. The evidence suggested the murders occurred in the early morning hours, possibly between midnight and 5 in the morning. The killer would have needed hours after that to conduct their ritual behaviors, to eat and smoke and wash and cover every face and mirror in the house. By the time Mary Peckham noticed the unusual stillness that Monday morning, the killer had likely been gone for only a short while. They might have slipped out of the house just before dawn. walking away through the quiet streets of Villisca while the town still slept. The crime scene revealed other disturbing details. A lamp had been carried from room to room, its chimney found in different locations from its base. The killer had needed light to see their victims, to navigate the unfamiliar house, to perform their careful ritual of covering. They had moved deliberately, without apparent panic or haste. The doors were locked from the inside. The killer had secured the house after the murders, creating a sealed tomb that delayed discovery for hours. No signs of forced entry were found. Either the killer possessed a key, or they had entered while the doors were still unlocked, perhaps hiding in the house while the family prepared for bed. The thought was almost unbearable for the community. To imagine the killer concealed in a closet or attic space, listening to the Moore family settling down for the night, waiting for the house to grow quiet and still, then emerging from hiding to commit systematic murder. The investigation that followed would consume the town. Suspects would be questioned, theories proposed, paranoia spreading like poison through the close-knit community. But standing in that dark house on the morning of June 10, 1912, looking at the covered faces and draped mirrors, at the bowl of bloody water and the half-eaten food, investigators confronted a kind of evil that defied easy explanation. This was not a crime of passion or a robbery gone wrong. The ritual elements, the hours spent lingering at the scene, the careful covering of faces and mirrors, all pointed to something darker and more complex. What kind of person commits such an act? What compulsion drives someone to not only kill but to remain with the dead, to eat and smoke and perform strange rituals in a house filled with corpses? The Villisca Axe Murders would haunt investigators and amateur sleuths for generations. But on that June morning, the questions were just beginning. And the answers, if they existed at all, were as carefully hidden as the faces beneath those blood-soaked bedclothes. The morning after the murders, the bloodhounds brought to Villisca picked up a scent that led directly to the door of the Presbyterian church. This strange detail would haunt the investigation for years to come, because on the night before the killings, Joe and Sarah Moore's children had attended a special program at that very church. The man who delivered the sermon that evening was Reverend George Kelly, a traveling minister whose behavior in the days following the massacre would transform him into the prime suspect in one of America's most notorious unsolved crimes. Kelly was not a local man. He drifted from town to town throughout Iowa, preaching at small churches that couldn't afford permanent clergy. He was 41 years old in 1912, with thinning hair and eyes that seemed never to settle on anything for long. Those who knew him described a man who struggled to connect with others, whose sermons rambled and sometimes veered into territory that made congregations uncomfortable. There was something off about George Kelly, something the people of Villisca sensed even before the children's program on that Sunday evening of June 9. The program itself had been unremarkable. Children recited verses and sang hymns while proud parents watched from wooden pews. Kelly had spoken briefly, his message forgettable enough that most attendees couldn't recall the specifics days later. The Moore children were there along with their overnight guests, Lena and Ina Gertrude Stillinger. By most accounts, nothing unusual happened. The families went home. Within hours, someone would enter the Moore house with an axe and leave 8 people dead. But Kelly didn't leave town immediately after the murders. This was his first suspicious behavior. Most traveling ministers would have moved on to their next engagement, yet Kelly lingered in Villisca for several days, inserting himself into conversations about the crime, asking questions that struck investigators as oddly specific. He wanted to know details about the crime scene. He inquired about the position of the bodies. He seemed fascinated by the children, particularly the Stillinger girls. Witnesses reported seeing him near the Moore house, staring at the windows, his face unreadable. When Kelly finally departed Villisca, he continued his circuit through Iowa's small towns. But now, he carried the murders with him like a weight. Ministers in neighboring communities reported that Kelly seemed obsessed with the Villisca case, bringing it up in conversations, speculating about the killer's motives. In one church, he allegedly told a group of parishioners that he had been in Villisca the night of the murders and had heard screams coming from the Moore house, but had done nothing. In another town, he supposedly claimed he could describe the crime scene in perfect detail because God had shown him visions of what transpired. These statements eventually reached law enforcement in Villisca. By 1915, 3 years after the murders, George Kelly had become a person of interest. The investigation had stalled completely. Leads had evaporated. The community was desperate for answers, for someone to blame, for the nightmare to end. Kelly, with his strange behavior and incriminating statements, seemed like a gift. Then came the confession. Or confessions, rather. Kelly's mental state had deteriorated significantly in the years since the murders. He had been in and out of institutions, diagnosed with what doctors of the era called acute mania. In 1917, while being questioned by investigators, Kelly allegedly confessed to the killings. The details of this confession remain disputed. Some reports claim he provided information only the killer could know. Others suggest the interrogation was coercive, that Kelly was mentally incompetent, that investigators fed him details he then parroted back. Almost immediately after confessing, Kelly recanted. He claimed the investigators had bullied him, that he had been confused, that he was innocent. Then, he confessed again. Then, he recanted again. This pattern continued for months, transforming the investigation into a bizarre theater where the suspect seemed unable to maintain a consistent story, and authorities couldn't determine if they were dealing with a murderer or a mentally ill man who had become fixated on a notorious crime. The prosecution eventually brought Kelly to trial in 1917. The case against him was circumstantial. He had been in Villisca on the night of the murders. He had displayed bizarre behavior afterward. He had made incriminating statements and multiple confessions. But there was no physical evidence linking him to the crime scene. No blood on his clothing. No witnesses placing him at the Moore house. No clear motive beyond speculation about mental illness. The trial became a spectacle. Kelly's defense attorneys argued their client was insane, that his confessions were the delusions of a sick mind seeking attention or punishment for imagined sins. The prosecution painted him as a cunning killer who feigned madness to escape justice. Witnesses testified about Kelly's odd demeanor and his suspicious questions about the murders. Alienists, the psychiatrists of that era, presented conflicting opinions about Kelly's sanity. The jury deliberated and returned deadlocked. A second trial was ordered. Again, the same evidence was presented, the same witnesses called, the same arguments made. Again, the jury could not reach a unanimous verdict. After 2 mistrials, the state of Iowa declined to prosecute Kelly a third time. He walked free, neither convicted nor exonerated, forever marked as the man who might have slaughtered 8 people in their sleep. But George Kelly was not the only suspect who emerged from the chaos of the investigation. While authorities focused on the unstable minister, another theory gained traction among Villisca's residents, one that involved wealth, power, and revenge. This theory centered on Frank Jones, one of the most prominent men in town. Frank Jones was everything Josiah Moore was not. Where Moore struggled to establish his farm implement business, Jones thrived. He owned multiple businesses in Villisca and across southwestern Iowa. He served as a state senator, wielding political influence that extended far beyond the town's borders. He lived in a grand house that announced his status to everyone who passed. Frank Jones was the kind of man who expected deference, and who did not forget slights. Josiah Moore had once worked for Frank Jones, employed in Jones's implement business. The relationship had been profitable for both men until Moore made a decision that Jones viewed as the ultimate betrayal. Moore left to start his own competing implement business, taking knowledge of Jones's operations, his customer lists, and his sales technique. To make matters worse, Moore succeeded. His business cut into Jones's profits. In small-town Iowa, where a man's reputation and business were intertwined with his identity, this was unforgivable. The feud between Jones and Moore became common knowledge in Villisca. They avoided each other at public gatherings. They sat on opposite sides of the church. Their wives no longer spoke. Business associates had to navigate carefully between the two camps. For a man like Frank Jones, accustomed to dominance and control, the situation must have festered like an open wound. After the murders, whispers began almost immediately. Why had the Moore family been targeted? Was it random or personal? Who had reason to hate Josiah Moore enough to butcher his entire family? The whispers inevitably led to Frank Jones. But Jones was a state senator, a pillar of the community. Could such a man be capable of mass murder? The theory that gained traction suggested Jones didn't need to be capable of murder himself. He only needed to hire someone who was. Enter William Mansfield, a name that would haunt the investigation for decades. Mansfield was not from Villisca, but his connection to the case emerged through a twisted path of evidence and speculation. Mansfield had worked for Frank Jones as a cocaine-addicted drifter who sometimes helped with odd jobs. More significantly, Mansfield was suspected in a series of similar axe murders that swept through the Midwest during the years around the Villisca killings. The similarities between these crimes were chilling. In Paola, Kansas, an entire family had been butchered with an axe in their sleep. In Ellsworth, Kansas, another family met the same fate. In Monmouth, Illinois, the pattern repeated. In each case, the victims were killed in their beds with an axe. In several cases, the killer had covered the victims' faces with cloth. Windows had been covered. The murders seemed ritualistic, methodical, the work of someone who had done this before. Mansfield's name appeared in connection to several of these crimes. He had been in the vicinity of multiple murder sites. He had worked as an itinerant laborer, moving from town to town. And crucially, some investigators believed Frank Jones had employed Mansfield in the months before the Villisca murders. The theory became elaborate, almost conspiratorial in its complexity. Frank Jones, consumed by hatred for Josiah Moore, had hired William Mansfield to murder his former employee. Jones knew Moore's habits, his home's layout, when the family would be asleep and vulnerable. He provided Mansfield with information and payment, then ensured he had an alibi for the night of the killings. Mansfield, already a serial killer, carried out the murders with his characteristic brutality, then disappeared back into the Midwest, leaving no evidence connecting him to Jones. This theory explained why the crime seemed both random and personal. It accounted for the killer's knowledge of the Moore house. It provided a motive beyond the senseless violence of a drifter or madman. For those who believed it, the Jones-Mansfield conspiracy answered every question the investigation had raised. But like the case against George Kelly, the evidence was circumstantial. Mansfield was investigated, even brought in for questioning. He denied involvement in Villisca and couldn't be placed in the town on the night of the murders. Frank Jones was never seriously charged, his political connections perhaps shielding him from deeper scrutiny. The conspiracy theory remained exactly that, a theory, compelling but unproven. The existence of multiple suspects, multiple theories, and multiple possible explanations created a toxic atmosphere in Villisca. The paranoia that gripped the town in the immediate aftermath of the murders never fully dissipated. It evolved into something more corrosive, a deep suspicion that infected every relationship and social interaction. Neighbors began to suspect neighbors. Anyone who had known the Moore family became a potential killer. Anyone who had been seen near the house in the days before the murders fell under suspicion. The traveling salesmen who passed through town regularly, the hired hands who worked on nearby farms, even longtime residents who couldn't account for their whereabouts on the night of June 9th to 10th became subjects of gossip and speculation. This paranoia was fed by the investigation itself, which seemed to chase every possible lid, no matter how thin. The authorities interviewed hundreds of people. They followed up on tips that ranged from credible to absurd. Every person who had ever had a dispute with Josiah Moore was investigated. Every drifter who had passed through Villisca in the weeks before the murders was tracked down if possible. The dragnet was wide and indiscriminate, casting suspicion on innocent people whose only crime was being in the wrong place at the wrong time. The case also attracted what we might today call dark tourists and true crime enthusiasts, though in 1912 and the years that followed, they were simply called morbid curiosity seekers. They came to Villisca to see the murder house, to walk past it, and imagine the horrors that had occurred inside. Some claimed psychic abilities and offered to commune with the spirits of the dead. Others were amateur detectives, convinced they could solve a case that stumped professional investigators. False confessors emerged regularly. Men and occasionally women would claim responsibility for the murders, providing detailed accounts that fell apart under scrutiny. Some sought notoriety. Others were mentally ill, like Kelly, fixated on a crime they hadn't committed, but somehow felt responsible for. Each false confession required investigation, wasting time and resources while the real killer, if still alive, remained free. Grifters saw opportunity in the tragedy. They sold supposed inside information to newspapers and magazines, hungry for any new angle on the story. They wrote pamphlets and self-published books claiming to reveal the true killer. They charged admission to lectures where they would present their theories to audiences who paid good money for speculation dressed up as fact. The Villisca Axe Murders became more than a crime. They became an industry, a cottage economy built on tragedy and fear. The town itself became synonymous with horror, its name forever linked to that June night when 8 people were butchered in their sleep. For the residents who remained, who tried to rebuild their lives and their community, this transformation was perhaps as traumatic as the murders themselves. Years passed, then decades. George Kelly died in 1933, never convicted but never cleared. William Mansfield died in 1938, suspected of multiple murders but proven guilty of none. Frank Jones died in 1954, taking whatever secrets he held to his grave. The generation that had lived through the murders gradually died off, replaced by children and grandchildren who knew the story only as local legend. But the questions remained. Who killed the Moore family and the Stillinger sisters? Was it Reverend Kelly, driven by religious mania or sexual compulsion? Was it William Mansfield, a serial killer hired by Frank Jones to settle an old score? Was it someone else entirely, a suspect who was never identified, whose name never appeared in the investigation files? The case file remained open, unsolved, a wound that never healed. The rain came down in sheets that night, in Villisca, Iowa. It was the kind of storm that turned the dirt roads into rivers of mud and drummed against windows with such force that it drowned out nearly every other sound. Nearly. Because somewhere in the darkness of that June night in 1912, someone was moving through the rain with purpose and urgency. And in the morning, when Sarah Moore and her 4 children, along with the 2 young Stillinger girls, were found murdered in their beds, that rain took on a different meaning entirely. It had been the perfect accomplice, masking footsteps, muffling sounds, washing away evidence. But it had not erased everything. It could not erase the witnesses. In the days and weeks following the murders, as investigators scrambled to make sense of the carnage, a pattern began to emerge from witness testimonies that would haunt the investigation for decades to come. Multiple townspeople reported seeing a stranger in Villisca on the day of the murders. Not just any stranger, but a man whose presence stood out, whose behavior raised questions, whose appearance several people could describe with unsettling consistency. He was middle-aged, they said, dressed in dark clothing that seemed almost formal for a small Iowa town on a Sunday. He wore a hat pulled low, and he moved through the streets with what some described as nervous energy, constantly looking around, never quite meeting anyone's gaze directly. Mrs. Mary Landers, who lived just 3 blocks from the Moore home, told investigators that she had seen this man twice that day. Once in the early afternoon, walking past her house with what she described as deliberate slowness, as though he were counting addresses or looking for something specific. The second time was more troubling. It was early evening, just as dusk was settling over the town, and she saw him standing across from the Moore residence, partially concealed by a large tree. He was not simply passing by. He was watching. When Mrs. Landers stepped onto her porch to get a better look, the man turned and walked away quickly, disappearing around the corner. She remembered thinking it was odd, suspicious even, but in that moment before the murders, before the horror descended on Villisca, she had no framework for understanding what she had witnessed. It was only later, when detectives came knocking, that the memory took on its full, terrible significance. But Mrs. Landers was not alone in her sighting. Ed Eckert, a local merchant, reported serving this same man, or someone matching his description exactly, in his store around 4 in the afternoon. The stranger purchased cigarettes and asked what time the train departed that evening. Eckert remembered the question because there were multiple trains that stopped in Villisca, and the man had not specified where he wanted to go. When Eckert asked his destination, the stranger paused too long before answering. "Chicago," he finally said, but Eckert did not believe him. Something in the man's manner suggested he had made up the answer on the spot. The stranger paid quickly and left without waiting for change from his dollar, another detail that stuck in Eckert's mind. Then there was Reverend Ewing, who had conducted the Children's Day program at the Presbyterian Church that very evening. The last public event the Moore family and the Stillinger girls attended before returning home to their deaths. Reverend Ewing told police that he had noticed a man standing at the back of the church during the program, someone he did not recognize from the congregation. This was unusual because Children's Day was primarily attended by families with participating children, and this man was alone. He stood rather than sat, positioning himself near the door, and he left before the program concluded. The Reverend watched him go and felt a prickle of unease, though he could not have articulated why at the time. The man seemed to be watching the Moore family with particular interest, his gaze returning again and again to where they sat in the third row. These sightings alone would have been enough to make this stranger a person of interest. But it was what happened in the early morning hours during the storm that transformed him into the central figure of the most tantalizing theory in the entire case. Because multiple witnesses reported seeing a man matching the same description boarding the 507 train that departed Villisca in the darkness before dawn, while the rain was still falling in torrents. The timing was absolutely critical. Based on the estimated time of death and the condition of the bodies when they were discovered, the murders likely occurred between midnight and 2 in the morning. The 507 departure would have been the first train leaving town after the crimes were committed, and someone was desperate to be on it. The most detailed account came from Harvey and Ellen McCutcheon, who lived near the train depot. Harvey was a light sleeper, troubled by insomnia, and he was awake in the early morning hours, listening to the rain hammer against the roof. He heard the train whistle in the distance, announcing its approach to the station, and out of idle curiosity, he went to his window to watch it arrive. What he saw troubled him enough that he woke his wife to confirm he was not imagining things. Through the rain and darkness, illuminated only by the dim lights of the depot, he saw a man running toward the platform. Not walking quickly, but actually running, his coat pulled up over his head, splashing through puddles with obvious urgency. The man was alone. There were no other passengers waiting to board at that ungodly hour, in that terrible weather. Harvey watched as the man climbed aboard, and the train pulled away into the darkness, its lights disappearing into the rain like a ghost fading into mist. When the murders were discovered later that morning, Harvey McCutcheon immediately thought of the running man. He went straight to the authorities with his account, and his wife corroborated every detail. They had both seen him clearly enough to provide a description: medium height, stocky build, dark suit soaked through with rain, hat pulled low. It matched the descriptions given by Mrs. Landers, Ed Eckert, and Reverend Ewing with chilling consistency. 4 different witnesses, at different times and locations throughout the day and night, had seen what appeared to be the same man. A man who had watched the Moore home. A man who had attended the church program. A man who had asked about train schedules. And finally, a man who had fled town on the first available train after the murders occurred, running through a rainstorm as though pursued by demons. The investigation that followed was extensive. Detectives contacted railway officials and obtained passenger lists, but the 507 had been a small, local train with minimal record-keeping, especially for passengers who paid cash on board. No one matching the description appeared on any official manifest. Inquiries were sent to Chicago, to Des Moines, to every stop along that route. Police in neighboring counties were alerted to watch for a man matching the description. Newspapers published detailed accounts of the stranger's appearance, hoping someone, somewhere would recognize him and come forward. Nobody ever did. The man had vanished as completely as if he had never existed at all, dissolved into the rain and darkness like a nightmare at dawn. This is where the theories multiply and fragment. Some investigators became convinced that the mysterious stranger was Reverend George Kelly, the traveling preacher who had been in Villisca that day, and who later confessed to the murders multiple times before recanting. Kelly was known to have attended the Children's Day program, and his appearance could roughly match the descriptions, though witnesses who saw both Kelly and the stranger insisted they were different men. Kelly was taller, thinner, with distinctive features that did not quite align with the stocky medium-height man described by multiple witnesses. But memory is fallible, especially under the pressure of such a horrific crime. Could the witnesses have been describing Kelly and simply misremembering details? It is possible, though the consistency of their accounts argues against it. Others believe the stranger could have been William Mansfield, the other prime suspect in the case. Mansfield had worked for the Moore family briefly, and had left town under suspicious circumstances before the murders. He was known to hold a grudge against Josiah Moore, and had been heard making threatening statements. Mansfield's build matched the stranger's description more closely than Kelly's did. He was stocky, medium height, and he had a documented history of violence. But Mansfield's alibi placed him in Illinois at the time of the murders, working on a construction crew with multiple witnesses who vouched for his presence. The alibi was never definitively broken, though some investigators believed it could have been fabricated or mistaken. Could Mansfield have slipped away, taken a train to Villisca, committed the murders, and fled on that early morning departure, returning to Illinois before his absence was noted? The timeline was tight, almost impossibly so, but not entirely out of the question. And then there is the most unsettling possibility of all, that the stranger was neither Kelly nor Mansfield, but someone else entirely. Someone completely unknown to history, whose identity died with him, whose motives remain forever obscured. Perhaps a drifter, drawn to Villisca by chance or by some dark compulsion we cannot fathom. Perhaps someone with a connection to the Moore family that was never discovered, a grudge or obsession that left no trace in the historical record. This theory is the hardest to accept because it offers no resolution, no name to attach to the horror, no way to close the circle of understanding. But it may also be the closest to the truth. The stranger could have been anyone, and he disappeared so completely that he might as well have been no one at all. Standing at the Villisca train depot today, more than a century later, you can still feel the weight of that unanswered question. The depot is long abandoned, the tracks silent, but close your eyes during a rainstorm, and you can almost hear it. The whistle in the distance, the rumble of wheels on rails, the sound of escape, of a killer vanishing into the night while a town slept, unaware of the nightmare waiting in the morning light. There is a bitter irony that haunts this detail of the case. Today, millions of people around the world use recordings of rain and train sounds to help them fall asleep. They find comfort in those ambient noises, a sense of peace and security. But in Villisca, on that June night in 1912, those same sounds may have been the soundtrack to a perfect murder. The rain that masked the killer's approach and departure. The train that carried him away to anonymity. The sounds that now lull us to sleep were once the tools of someone who took 8 lives and was never made to answer for it. The witnesses are all gone now, their testimonies preserved only in faded police reports and newspaper clippings. Mrs. Landers, Ed Eckert, Reverend Ewing, the McCutcheons, they all eventually passed away without ever learning the stranger's identity. They carried their memories to their graves, the image of that man in the dark suit, his hat pulled low, his nervous energy, his watching eyes. And somewhere, in some unmarked grave, perhaps the stranger himself lies buried, his secret intact, his identity lost to time. Unless, of course, he lived many more years after Villisca, carrying the weight of what he had done, looking over his shoulder whenever he heard a train whistle or felt rain on his face. We will never know. And that, perhaps, is the most haunting aspect of all. The Villisca Axe murders remain unsolved, not because there were no clues, but because the most promising clue, the most tantalizing piece of evidence, simply evaporated into the storm. The stranger came, he watched, and if the witnesses are to be believed, he killed. And then he vanished on a rain-soaked morning, leaving behind nothing but questions and the fading echo of a departing train. The house stood silent through the changing seasons, its white clapboard siding weathering from fresh paint to a dull, muted gray that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. After the trials concluded, and the media circus finally packed up their cameras and satellite trucks, the property on 2nd Street became something else entirely. Not just a crime scene, not simply an address where tragedy had occurred, but a monument to questions that would never be answered and horrors that could never be undone. For years, the structure remained empty. Local real estate agents found themselves unable to move the property, despite dropping the asking price again and again. Potential buyers would schedule viewings, arrive with their notepads and measuring tapes, and then find reasons to leave before completing their tours. Some cited the impracticality of the layout. Others mentioned foundation concerns or plumbing issues. But many simply walked back to their cars in silence, moving with the careful, deliberate steps of people who wanted distance between themselves and something they couldn't quite name. The house had developed a reputation that preceded any showing, any open house, any attempt at normalcy. Everyone knew what had happened there. Everyone knew the story of the 8 lives that ended in those rooms during the darkest hours of a November night. The city found itself in an unusual position. What do you do with a house that nobody wants but everyone talks about? The property couldn't be demolished without approval, yet keeping it vacant invited vandalism, break-ins, and the kind of morbid tourism that no community welcomes. Teenagers began using it as a test of courage, daring each other to approach the windows, to touch the front door, to stand in the yard after midnight. Some claimed they could hear things through the walls, even from the sidewalk. Others swore they saw lights moving inside the windows despite the electricity having been shut off years earlier. Then someone had an idea. If the public fascination wouldn't fade, perhaps it could be channeled, controlled, even monetized. By the late 1980s, the property had been acquired by a series of owners who recognized its unique position in American crime history and paranormal lore. Rather than fighting against the house's dark reputation, they leaned into it. The Villisca Axe Murder House, as it became officially known, opened its doors to visitors, first as a daytime museum, offering guided tours through the rooms where an entire family and 2 young houseguests had been bludgeoned to death, and eventually, as something far more ambitious and unsettling, a location for overnight paranormal investigations. The transformation from crime scene to tourist attraction to paranormal investigation site represents a uniquely American phenomenon. We are drawn to darkness, compelled by tragedy, fascinated by the possibility that death leaves something behind beyond empty rooms and fading memories. The house began attracting visitors from across the country. True crime enthusiasts who wanted to stand in the spaces they'd read about. Amateur ghost hunters equipped with electromagnetic field detectors and digital voice recorders. Skeptics determined to debunk the growing legends. And those who simply wanted to test themselves against fear, to spend a night where such incomprehensible violence had occurred, and emerge with a story to tell. What they found inside, many claim, defied their expectations entirely. The reports began accumulating almost immediately after the overnight stays commenced. Visitors described hearing the distinct sounds of children's voices, echoing through the upstairs rooms. Sometimes laughing, sometimes calling out words that couldn't quite be understood. The sounds seemed to originate from specific locations. The bedroom where the 4 more children had slept, the space where the Stillinger girls had been arranged so carefully after death. Multiple independent groups, arriving weeks or months apart with no contact between them, reported hearing the same phenomenon. Children speaking and laughing in rooms where no children stood. One woman, a school teacher from Iowa, who came with her sister for an overnight investigation, later described hearing what sounded like a little girl crying. The sound was so clear, so immediate, that she initially believed another group must have brought a child along, despite the strict age restriction. She followed the crying down the narrow hallway toward the children's room, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. When she reached the doorway and shone her light inside, the crying stopped instantly. The room was empty. She swept her light across every corner, checking behind the bed near the closet. Nothing. The silence felt heavier than the crying had, as though something had been interrupted, paused mid-expression. Her sister, standing at the base of the stairs, heard the crying too. Both women confirmed they heard it simultaneously, from different locations in the house. Neither could find a source. The apparition of a man carrying an axe has been reported enough times to establish a pattern. He appears, witnesses say, as a dark figure moving with purpose through the downstairs rooms. Most often spotted in the parlor or near the stairs, this shadow seems to follow the route the killer might have taken that night. A retired police officer visiting from Michigan described waking at approximately 2 in the morning to see a tall, broad-shouldered figure standing in the doorway of the downstairs bedroom. The figure held something long and heavy in both hands, positioned at shoulder height. The witness watched for several seconds, assuming it was another member of his investigation group, before realizing that everyone else was accounted for and asleep in different rooms. When he called out, asking who was there, the figure dissipated like smoke caught in a draft. The officer, trained in observation and not prone to flights of imagination, struggled to explain what he'd witnessed. His description matched at least 7 other independent accounts collected over the years. Objects move in the house. Not dramatically, not with the theatrical flair of Hollywood productions, but with a persistence that unnerves even prepared investigators. The closet door in the downstairs bedroom closes repeatedly throughout the night. This is the closet where evidence suggests the killer may have hidden, waiting for the family to fall into deep sleep before beginning his methodical violence. Visitors prop the door open, wedge it with shoes or equipment cases, and return minutes or hours later to find it closed again. No drafts seem sufficient to explain the movement. One paranormal investigation team installed a night vision camera aimed directly at the door, hoping to capture the moment of closure. The footage shows the door slowly, steadily swinging shut over the course of approximately 3 minutes. No visible force acts upon it. No vibrations register on their equipment. The door simply closes, as though pulled by an invisible, patient hand. The upstairs bedrooms carry a weight that affects nearly everyone who enters them. Multiple visitors have described an overwhelming sense of dread in these specific rooms, a feeling so intense it becomes physical. Nausea, difficulty breathing, the sensation of being watched by something hostile and calculating. A journalist who came to write a skeptical piece about paranormal tourism found herself unable to remain upstairs for more than 10 minutes. She described feeling as though the air itself had become heavier, pressing down on her chest and shoulders. Her ears began ringing. Her vision narrowed. She retreated downstairs and spent the rest of the night in the parlor, embarrassed by her reaction, but unable to overcome the physical response her body had to those upper rooms. Technology fails in predictable patterns inside the house. Cameras malfunction in specific locations, particularly in the room where the parents died and in the closet doorway. Batteries drain from full charge to dead within minutes. Digital recorders that worked perfectly during equipment checks before entering the house produce only static or fail to record entirely once inside certain rooms. A professional photographer attempting to document the house for a magazine feature went through 6 different camera batteries in the master bedroom alone. Each one showed full charge when inserted, then died within moments of attempting to photograph the space. His equipment worked perfectly in every other room of the house. He had no explanation. The most compelling incidents involve groups who left before completing their overnight stays. The house has rules, expectations shared with every visitor who books a night inside. You stay until dawn. You experience what you experience. You respect the space and the history it contains. But some cannot finish what they started. A couple from Minnesota fled at approximately 3:30 in the morning, running to their car and refusing to speak about what they'd encountered until they'd driven several miles away. When they finally felt safe enough to discuss the experience, they described hearing footsteps climbing the stairs toward the room where they'd been attempting to sleep. Heavy footsteps, deliberate and steady. The steps reached the top landing, paused, then moved directly toward their door. They called out, believing it must be the caretaker checking on them. No one answered. The footsteps stopped just outside their door. They could see the shadow of feet blocking the light from the crack beneath the door frame. For nearly a full minute, something stood outside their room in the darkness and silence. Then, without any sound of retreat, without any footsteps moving away, the shadow disappeared. The couple waited another 10 minutes, gathering courage, before opening the door to an empty hallway. They left immediately, forfeiting the remainder of their paid overnight experience. A group of college students made it until 4 in the morning before 3 of the 5 members demanded to leave. They'd been using various pieces of paranormal investigation equipment, including devices that supposedly detect changes in electromagnetic fields and temperature. In the children's bedroom, all their equipment began registering readings simultaneously. The temperature, according to their instruments, dropped nearly 15 degrees in less than 2 minutes. Their electromagnetic field detectors maxed out their scales. And then, they all heard it. The sound of children giggling, close enough to seem like it came from inside the room with them, but hollow, as though echoing up from somewhere deep and distant. When one of the students demanded that whatever was there should reveal itself, something in the closet slammed hard enough to shake the wall. That was sufficient. 3 members of the group left immediately. The 2 who remained reported nothing else unusual for the rest of the night, as though the house had said what it needed to say. These stories accumulate into a database of the unexplainable, too consistent to dismiss as pure fabrication, too strange to accept without question. Skeptics point to the power of suggestion, the way knowledge of a tragedy primes our perception, and transforms ordinary sounds into evidence of the supernatural. They note that old houses settle and creak, that temperature fluctuations occur naturally, that groups expecting paranormal activity will interpret ambiguous experiences through that lens. These arguments carry weight. Human perception is unreliable under stress and in darkness. Our brains construct narratives from incomplete information. We see patterns where none exist. We hear meaning in random noise. But what do we do with the police officer who saw the figure with the axe? With the photographer whose equipment failed in one specific room? With the consistency of reports about children's voices from people who had no contact with previous visitors? With the closet door that closes itself on camera? Skepticism provides valuable perspective, but it doesn't fully account for the accumulated weight of testimony from witnesses who came prepared to find nothing remarkable. The psychological experience of spending a night in the Villisca house extends beyond questions of ghosts or residual energy. There is something profound and unsettling about occupying a space where such violence occurred. You know what happened in these rooms. You know that children slept in those beds, woke to terror, experienced pain beyond imagining in their final moment. You know that parents died trying to protect their family, or perhaps died still sleeping, never given the chance to fight back. That knowledge seeps into your awareness with every creak of the floorboards, every shift of shadow. You cannot unknow the history. You cannot pretend these are neutral, meaningless spaces. Perhaps this is what people experience in the Villisca house. Not ghosts in the traditional sense, not the literal spirits of the dead trapped between worlds, but something equally powerful: the psychological imprint of tragedy. The human mind's tendency to populate dark spaces with our deepest fears. The weight of empathy for victims long dead but never forgotten. The house becomes a canvas onto which we project our anxieties about violence, about vulnerability, about the thin line between peaceful sleep and sudden death. Or perhaps the house truly holds something beyond psychology and suggestion. Perhaps violent death leaves an energetic signature, a disturbance in the fabric of a place that sensitive individuals can detect. Perhaps consciousness doesn't entirely extinguish but lingers in fragments, particularly when it ends traumatically and without warning. The children's voices, the apparition with the axe, the closing door, the overwhelming dread in the upstairs rooms. Maybe these are echoes of that terrible night, playing endlessly in spaces that remember what occurred within them. The Villisca Axe Murder House continues to draw visitors more than a century after the murders. It stands as one of America's most active paranormal investigation sites, a place where the boundary between documented history and unexplained phenomenon becomes permeable and uncertain. People continue to book overnight stays, continue to bring their equipment and their questions, continue to seek something they often cannot articulate: proof of an afterlife, confirmation that consciousness survives death, or simply the primal thrill of confronting fear in its most concentrated form. The house offers no definitive answers. It provides experiences that each visitor must interpret through their own framework of belief and skepticism. But it continues to speak, whether through genuine paranormal activity or through the power of place and memory and collective fear. The rooms remember, either literally or through our insistence on remembering for them. And in the darkness of those upper bedrooms, where children once slept and died, something continues to manifest that science has not yet explained, and that those who experience it can never entirely forget. The discovery at Villisca was horrifying enough on its own. 6 members of the Moore family and 2 visiting children, all murdered in their beds with the blunt side of an axe. But what investigators and the public didn't fully grasp in 1912 was that Villisca was not an isolated event. It was merely one bead on a string of nearly identical murders that stretched across the American Midwest like a blood-soaked railroad map. The pattern was there, waiting to be seen. But in an era before the Federal Bureau of Investigation, before centralized criminal databases, before states routinely shared information about crimes committed within their borders, each atrocity was investigated in isolation. Local sheriffs examined local crimes, city police departments handled city cases, and between these jurisdictional islands, someone was moving freely through the darkness, riding the rails that connected America's heartland, selecting victims with terrifying randomness. The signs were unmistakable to anyone who looked closely enough. Between 1911 and 1912, a series of family annihilations occurred across Iowa, Kansas, Illinois, Missouri, and Colorado. The similarities weren't just striking. They were chilling in their specificity. Entire families murdered in their sleep. An axe as the weapon of choice. Faces covered with bedclothes after death. Windows covered or curtains drawn. Doors locked from the inside. And perhaps most disturbing, small ritual elements that suggested not rage or robbery, but something far more sinister. The first whispers of connection came from a few observant lawmen who read newspapers from neighboring states, who noticed the uncomfortable similarities. But their warnings went largely unheeded. Most people couldn't fathom what these patterns suggested. The very concept of a serial killer was alien to the American consciousness in the early 20th century. Murder was understood as personal, a crime of passion, a dispute gone wrong, robbery turned violent. The idea that someone might kill strangers for psychological gratification, that someone might travel hundreds of miles to murder people they'd never met, was simply beyond the framework of normal criminal investigation. But the evidence was mounting, case by horrible case. On the night of September 27, 1911, in Colorado Springs, Colorado, the Burnham family was destroyed. Henry Burnham, his wife Nettie, and their 3 young children were found dead in their beds. The killer had used the blunt side of an axe, striking each victim while they slept. Their faces had been covered with bedclothes. A lamp had been left burning in the kitchen, its chimney removed. The murderer had moved through the house methodically, covering windows and mirrors with fabric. Nothing of value had been taken. The doors were found locked from the inside, suggesting the killer had secured the house before climbing out through a window. The crime scene bore the mark of ritual. Food had been left uneaten on the kitchen table. Water had been prepared in a basin, as if the killer had washed before leaving. Small objects had been moved or rearranged in ways that served no practical purpose. Investigators were baffled. Who would murder an entire family and take nothing? What possible motive could explain such methodical brutality? The Burnham murders sent shock waves through Colorado Springs, but the story barely made newspapers in other states. It was a local tragedy, investigated by local authorities who had no way of knowing what was coming. Less than a month later, on October 15, 1911, in Monmouth, Illinois, the pattern repeated with horrifying precision. William Dawson, his wife, and their 2 young children were discovered in their beds, murdered with an axe. Once again, the blunt side of the weapon had been used to crush skulls. Once again, faces were covered. Once again, windows had been obscured and doors locked from within. The killer had struck in the dead of night, moving from bedroom to bedroom with practiced efficiency. The Monmouth sheriff noted the strange ritual elements. A lamp burning low. A pan of bloody water in the kitchen where the killer had apparently cleaned up. Kerosene splashed on the walls in one room, though no fire had been set. Mirrors covered with cloth. These details troubled investigators, but without a framework for understanding them, the elements were cataloged as oddities rather than recognized as signature behaviors. The Dawson family had no known enemies. They were well-liked farmers, involved in their community, raising their children on land that had been in the family for generations. Investigators pursued theories of robbery, though nothing had been stolen. They investigated possible feuds, though none existed. They looked for jilted lovers, business disputes, inheritance schemes. Every conventional motive led nowhere. The case grew cold as winter set in. Then came Paola, Kansas. On the night of December 19, 1911, the Showman family was slaughtered. Once again, parents and children murdered in their beds with an axe. Once again, the ritualistic covering of faces and mirrors. Once again, the killer had washed before leaving, had rearranged objects, had moved through the house with a calmness that suggested this was not a crime of passion, but something planned and purposeful. By now, a few newspaper editors were beginning to notice the similarities. Articles appeared comparing the cases, asking if there might be a connection. But most lawmen dismissed the idea as sensational journalism. The distances were too great. The towns, too different. Surely these were coincidental similarities, tragic but unrelated. But the pattern continued. In Villisca, Iowa, on June 10, 1912. The Moore family and their 2 young house guests were found in their beds, skulls crushed by the blunt side of an axe, faces covered, mirrors draped, doors locked from inside. The killer had spent time in the house after the murders, eating food, preparing water in a basin. The similarities to the previous cases were undeniable, yet investigators in Villisca spent months pursuing local suspects, convinced the answer lay within their own community. The railroad theory emerged slowly, pieced together by those few who saw the larger pattern. Every murder had occurred in a town along major railroad lines. Every murder had happened in a house near the railroad tracks, where the sound of passing trains was a familiar nighttime occurrence. The killer could arrive in darkness, commit the murders, and disappear aboard an early morning freight train before the bodies were discovered. No horse required, no automobile to trace. Just a faceless drifter moving through the American heartland, invisible in the constant flow of railroad workers, seasonal laborers, and traveling men who rode the rails. Investigators who embraced this theory began looking at transient populations, who had been seen near the railroad yards on the nights of the murders. Were there men who appeared in multiple towns on the relevant dates? But tracking individuals across state lines in 1912 was nearly impossible. Thousands of men rode the rails. Some were hobos seeking work. Others were railroad employees, moving between assignments. Still others were criminals fleeing one jurisdiction for another. The sheer volume of potential suspects was overwhelming. What made the theory even more terrifying was its implication. If the killer was choosing victims randomly from towns along his route, then anyone living near railroad tracks was potentially at risk. There was no way to predict where he might strike next. No way to identify potential victims ahead of time. The murders seemed to follow no geographic pattern beyond proximity to rail lines. Small towns, medium-sized cities, different states, families with different surnames, different backgrounds, different lives. The only common thread was their vulnerability and their nearness to the rails. Some investigators theorized there might be more than one killer, perhaps 2 or 3 men traveling together, sharing some dark compulsion. This would explain how the crimes could occur with such frequency across such distances. But others argued the ritual elements were too consistent, too specific, suggesting a single individual with a particular psychological need driving the murders. The ritual components haunted everyone who studied the cases closely. The covering of faces suggested the killer couldn't bear to see his victim's eyes, or perhaps engaged in some post-mortem ritual that required privacy. The covering of mirrors might indicate superstition, a belief that mirrors could trap souls or reflect the killer's identity. The careful washing suggested both a practical desire to remove evidence and perhaps a psychological need for purification. The uneaten food and the time spent in the houses after the murders indicated the killer felt no urgency to flee, no fear of discovery. This was someone comfortable with death, someone who could sit calmly in a house full of corpses and methodically prepare for departure. Most disturbing was the targeting of entire families. The killer didn't simply murder the head of household. Every member of the family had to die. Children, infants, visiting guests. Anyone sleeping in the house that night became a victim. This suggested the murders weren't personal vendettas, but rather the destruction of the family unit itself held some significance for the killer. Was he erasing something he envied? Punishing some perceived sin? Acting out a twisted fantasy? Without the killer's own testimony, the psychological motivation remained terrifyingly opaque. By late 1912, some law enforcement officials were privately acknowledging the likelihood of a serial killer operating across state lines. But public acknowledgement was another matter. Admitting that a murderer had killed dozens of people and might kill again would cause widespread panic. It would also highlight the inability of local and state law enforcement to catch him. So the theory remained largely confined to quiet conversations between sheriffs and detectives, to speculative newspaper articles that were easily dismissed. And then, as suddenly as the pattern had emerged, it seemed to stop. After Villisca, the string of family annihilations ceased. No more axe murders fitting the specific pattern occurred in 1913 or 1914. Had the killer died? Been arrested for some other crime? Simply moved to a different region or changed his methods? No one knew. The silence was almost as disturbing as the murders had been. leaving investigators and the public with no resolution, no capture, no answers. The failure to connect these cases in real time represents one of the great tragedies of early American law enforcement. Had the cases been linked immediately, had resources been pooled, had investigators shared information across state lines, the killer might have been caught. Patterns might have been identified. Witnesses might have remembered the same suspicious figure appearing in multiple towns. But in the fragmented system of 1912, each jurisdiction worked in isolation, and the killer moved freely between the cracks. Today, criminal profilers and historians who examine these cases see clear evidence of serial murder. The consistency of method, the ritual elements, the geographic clustering along rail lines, the sudden cessation of activity, all point to a single individual or small group operating with terrifying efficiency across the Midwest. Whoever committed these murders was one of America's first serial killers, predating the famous cases that would define the phenomenon in the public imagination decades later. The families destroyed in these attacks were ordinary people living ordinary lives. They had no connection to one another beyond their geographic proximity to railroad lines and their vulnerability as they slept. They were victims of random selection, which makes their deaths even more disturbing. There was no way to predict who would be targeted, no way to prevent the attacks through caution or awareness. The killer came in darkness, struck without warning, and vanished like a nightmare that leaves only devastation in its wake. The true scope of the terror may never be fully known. These are only the cases that clearly fit the pattern, the murders that share multiple distinctive characteristics. There may have been others, cases where local authorities never released full details, or where evidence was lost to time. The killer may have been active before 1911 and after 1912, with only this concentrated period drawing enough attention for patterns to emerge. What we're left with is a chilling portrait of early 20th century America's vulnerability to a new kind of predator. Someone who understood that mobility was anonymity, that the railroad network connecting the nation could also be a hunting ground, that small-town sheriffs couldn't coordinate across state lines, and that entire families could be erased in the night while neighbors slept unaware just yards away. The Villisca murders weren't an isolated act of local violence. They were part of something much larger, much more systematic, and infinitely more terrifying. They were evidence that evil could ride the rails through America's heartland, selecting victims at random, and disappear into the vast anonymous landscape of a nation still learning to see itself whole. We return now to the present moment, to the silence that remains when all the theories have been exhausted and all the investigations have gone cold. More than 110 years have passed since that June morning in 1912, when neighbors found 8 bodies arranged in their beds. More than a century of questions, of investigations, of amateur detectives and professional lawmen poring over the same threadbare evidence. And still we are no closer to the truth than we were on that first terrible day. The Villisca Axe murders remain exactly what they were then, unsolved, unexplained, and utterly incomprehensible. We still do not know who killed the Moore family. We do not know who murdered Lena and Ina Mae Stillinger. Despite thousands of pages of testimony, despite confessions both true and false, despite the tireless work of investigators across decades, the identity of the killer remains hidden somewhere in the shadows of history. The questions linger like ghosts in an empty house. Was it the man on the train, the stranger seen boarding the midnight service to Omaha, his clothing rumored to be stained with something dark? Did Reverend Kelly, with his obsessive attendance at the children's funerals and his nervous breakdown that followed, know more than he ever revealed? Was Frank Jones involved in some conspiracy of revenge, using hired hands to destroy the family of his business rival? Or was it someone else entirely? Someone whose name never even entered the investigation, who killed for reasons we cannot fathom and then simply disappeared. And then there are the deeper mysteries, the questions that reach beyond simple identity into the realm of human darkness. If this was indeed connected to other killings, to those similar crimes that rippled across the Midwest in those years, what does that mean? Was there truly a killer who moved from town to town, selecting families at random, entering homes in the dead of night? The pattern suggests it. The similarities are too striking to ignore, but the proof remains forever out of reach. Why the ritual elements? Why cover the mirrors and windows? Why arrange the bodies just so, with clothing pulled over faces, with deliberate positioning that speaks of something beyond mere murder? These actions suggest meaning, purpose, some kind of twisted logic that made sense only to the killer. But what that logic was, what compelled these specific rituals, we will never know. And perhaps the most chilling question of all, what did the killer do during those hours waiting in the attic? The evidence suggests someone was there, in that cramped space above the children's room, waiting while the family attended church, while they walked home through the warm June evening, while they prepared for bed and drifted into sleep. What kind of person waits like that? What thoughts move through a mind capable of such patience, such terrible anticipation? This case continues to haunt our collective imagination for reasons that go beyond the simple mystery of an unsolved crime. There is something about Villisca that burrows into our deepest fears. Perhaps it is the vulnerability of sleep, the violation of home, the destruction of an entire family in the space of a few dark hours. Perhaps it is the randomness, the sense that this could happen to anyone, anywhere, without warning or reason. Or perhaps it is the silence that followed, the way the killer simply vanished like smoke, leaving nothing behind but blood and questions. There is a strange phenomenon in our modern world, one that connects us unknowingly to that terrible night. Millions of people now fall asleep each night listening to recorded sounds of rain and trains. These ambient noises, marketed as sleep aids and relaxation tools, have become a common companion to rest. Rain pattering against windows, the rhythmic clatter of train wheels on tracks, the distant whistle echoing through darkness. And we do not think, as we drift towards sleep with these sounds in our ears, that we are echoing the last things those children heard. The summer rain falling on the roof of the Moore house, the midnight train passing through town, carrying away a stranger whose name we will never know. The house still stands on East 2nd Street. You can visit it if you wish. You can walk through the rooms where it happened, sleep in the beds where they died if you are brave enough or foolish enough to try. The building has been restored to look as it did that night, preserved as a monument to unanswered questions. Tourists come from across the country, drawn by morbid curiosity or genuine interest in the mystery. They take photographs. They report strange experiences. They leave eventually, but the house remains, always waiting, always holding its secrets. Because somewhere in the scattered pages of history, a killer boarded a train in the rain and was never seen again. Somewhere in the gaps between what we know and what we can prove, the truth exists, but it exists beyond our reach. The killer may have lived out a normal life, may have died peacefully in bed decades later, carrying the secret to whatever lies beyond. Or perhaps they killed again and again until they finally made a mistake or simply stopped. We will never know. The rain falls on the window of a train, moving through the darkness, a sound that fades slowly into silence, into the vast and empty quiet where all unsolved mysteries eventually go. Into the place where questions remain questions forever. That's where this journey ends for tonight. If you made it all the way here, subscribe and hit the bell for more long-form stories like this. Check out the videos on screen for more right now. Drop your own experiences in the comments below. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.